The cruelest way to break a farmer is not to take the land. It's to take the one thing the land cannot survive without. Before sunrise, on a blistering July morning in western Colorado, Claire Whitmore stood beside the irrigation lateral that had fed Willow Bend Ranch for generations and stared at cracked mud where water should have been moving. She was 42, widowed, and responsible for 240 acres, 52 Black Angus cattle to feed. The ranch had survived drought, bad hay years, broken equipment, and the death of her husband. But it had never survived without water. Construction crews working above her property for Hallbrook Land and Development had altered drainage near the new Canyon Crest Estates project, and the gravity-fed flow carrying snowmelt down from the ridge had stopped. At first, Claire told herself it had to be temporary. Then the days began stacking up. The alfalfa leaves curled. Pasture faded from green to dusty gold. Stock tanks dropped lower each morning, forcing Claire to rent a tanker and haul water at a cost that made every mile hurt. Supplemental feed followed. Diesel followed. Every trip into town became another number added to a notebook she no longer wanted to open. Grant Hallbrook had already offered to buy Willow Bend more than once, always with the same polished smile and argument. The valley was changing, land values were rising, and Claire could walk away before ranching buried her in debt. She had refused every time. Now his subdivision sat above her dry ditch, and the timing felt too perfect to ignore. Some neighbors told her to call the county. Others told her to hire a lawyer. A few suggested she take Hallbrook's money while she still could. But Claire knew the numbers. If she kept paying for hauled water, feed, fuel, and repairs, Willow Bend had maybe 8 to 10 weeks before the cash reserve was gone. 8 to 10 weeks before she would have to sell cattle she had planned to keep. 8 to 10 weeks before refusing Hallbrook might stop being a choice. Then, while Claire stood beside the dead lateral, calculating how much time remained, her 12-year-old son Noah called from down the bank. Everything around him was brown, except one narrow patch of grass beneath an old cottonwood. It was green. Not barely alive. Green. Noah pressed his hand into the soil, looked back at his mother and said, "Mom, this ground is still wet." But while every adult around Willow Bend was staring at contracts, permits, cattle bills, and a dying irrigation ditch, 12-year-old Noah Whitmore was watching something far smaller and far more important. Claire spent her days calling county offices, leaving messages for attorneys, checking stock tanks, calculating feed costs, and trying not to think about the 8 to 10 week clock hanging over the ranch. Noah kept returning to the old cottonwood below the hillside. Beneath it, surrounded by brittle weeds and sunburned pasture, a narrow strip of sedge grass remained strangely green. Not morning dew green, not shaded green. Deep, healthy green. The first time Noah mentioned it, Claire barely looked up. She had bigger problems. But Noah had always noticed things other people walked past. For almost 2 years, he had carried a cheap spiral notebook in his back pocket, filling its pages with rainfall totals, creek levels, frog sightings, insect swarms, unusual plants, and small changes around the ranch. He had written about that same spot before. In late June, when the creek was already shrinking, he had found tiny flies hovering above the grass. The previous August, he had noticed cattle gathering there during the hottest part of the afternoon. Once, after nearly 3 weeks without rain, he had pushed a stick into the soil and found dark earth beneath the dry surface. None of it had seemed important then. Now it did. One afternoon, while Claire drove another rented tanker toward the stock troughs, Noah returned with a shovel. He knelt beside the cottonwood and pressed his palm against the ground. The surface was warm, but just beneath it, the soil felt cool enough to make him stop. He began digging. 4 inches down, the dirt darkened. At 6 inches, it clung to the shovel blade. Then, around 8 inches below the surface, metal struck something hard, with a sharp, unnatural clang. Noah expected sandstone. Instead, he brushed away the soil and uncovered the edge of a flat, rectangular stone. Another lay beside it. Then another. They were too straight, too evenly placed to be natural. Someone had put them there. He dug carefully along the line until the stones formed what looked like the roof of a narrow buried channel disappearing toward the hillside. Then he heard it, a faint sound beneath the rock. Not wind, not insects. Water. Noah pressed his ear closer and saw a thin trickle slipping through a gap between two stones. The ditch above the ranch was dead. The pasture was drying out. Yet underneath this forgotten patch of green ground, water was still moving. Noah dropped the shovel, ran toward the house, and shouted for his mother. Claire thought he had found a broken pipe. What he had actually uncovered had been waiting beneath Willow Bend for nearly a century. The discovery beneath Noah's shovel should have been impossible. But what Claire uncovered next suggested that Willow Bend Ranch had been hiding its own water system for nearly a century. Claire called Ben Whitmore, her 71-year-old father-in-law, and together with Noah they cleared more soil from the buried stones. Flat capstones rested over narrow stone walls, forming a covered channel that ran from the cottonwood toward the base of the hill. Ben stared at it before an old phrase surfaced from his memory. His father used to mention the spring gallery. Ben had heard the words as a boy, but no one had explained them, and by the time he was old enough to ask, the newer irrigation lateral had become the ranch's main source of water. Claire contacted Megan Cross, a county survey technician, and Megan spent 2 days searching old plats, easement books, and handwritten filings. Then she found it, a 1928 property map with a faint line running from the lower pasture directly into the hill. Beside it, in faded pencil, were the words, Spring Gallery. The line matched the stonework almost perfectly. That was enough to bring in Dr. Rachel Kim, a hydrologist from the State Extension Service. She tested the cool soil, the mineral content of the seep, and the elevation between the wet patch and the mesa above. Her conclusion changed everything. The moisture was not leaking from the blocked irrigation ditch. Groundwater was still emerging through fractured rock inside the hill. Nearly a century earlier, the first Whitmore ranchers had found that seep and built a horizontal stone collection system to capture it, then used gravity to carry the water downhill. There had been no electric pumps, no deep well, no diesel engine, only stone, hand tools, careful measurements, and a precise understanding of slope. Worse, for months, the field seemed to support Dean's argument. The grass remained thin. Their patches stayed bare. Dust still lifted under Caleb's boots. Nothing about the place looked rescued. Modern crews had reshaped the hillside with machines, drainage plans, and surveys, yet missed a water system built by ranchers with shovels almost 100 years earlier. And if the old gallery was still alive, Claire was no longer looking at a curious trickle beneath a tree. She might be standing above the one forgotten source of water that could decide whether Willow Bend Ranch survived. But the deeper they traced the forgotten spring, the more Claire realized they had uncovered something powerful enough to save Willow Bend, and fragile enough to disappear forever. Earl Benson, a retired ditch rider who had spent nearly 4 decades maintaining irrigation systems across the valley, arrived with a probe rod and years of experience reading water by sound and slope. Working from the stone channel Noah had uncovered, Earl followed the gallery toward the hillside, testing the ground every few feet. Much of the old system was still there. The stone walls had shifted in places, but the basic structure remained intact beneath roots, compacted soil, and generations of neglect. Then Earl's probe stopped. Roughly 160 feet inside the hill, the passage had partially collapsed beneath rockfall, tangled roots, and decades of sediment. Water was still finding a narrow path through the blockage, but Earl warned them not to confuse a living trickle with a safe tunnel. If they opened the wrong section too quickly, loosened stone could collapse farther uphill and bury the spring collection chamber permanently. They could destroy the very system they were trying to save. While Earl mapped the physical danger, Megan Cross and Ben Whitmore found something that made the discovery even more important. Old notes suggested the spring gallery had not belonged to the Whitmores alone. 3 ranching families may have helped build and maintain it, sharing labor and water. If that could be documented, the gallery was no longer just an abandoned structure beneath one ranch. It could be evidence of a historic agricultural water system older than Canyon Crest Estates itself. But Claire could not simply bring in a backhoe and start digging. She needed excavation approval, historical records, an engineering review, legal help, and money she did not have. Then Holbrook Land and Development filed an objection. Their attorneys claimed excavation near the hillside could threaten the grading and drainage work for Canyon Crest. To Claire, the argument sounded almost reasonable, until she noticed how fast they had responded. For weeks, Holbrook's people had treated her dry ditch like a minor inconvenience. Now, the moment an old spring appeared beneath Willow Bend, they were suddenly paying attention. Earl looked toward the subdivision and said what Claire had already begun to suspect. If they're this worried about a little stone tunnel, then it matters more than they're telling you. For the first time, Claire understood that finding the water might only be the beginning. Saving it could cost her the ranch before it ever had the chance to save her. But the old spring was about to reveal something far more dangerous than water. Proof that Holbrook may have known exactly what stood in his way before Claire ever lost a drop. Until then, Claire had been fighting with fragments. A buried stone gallery, a fading map, Ben's memories, and the thin trickle Noah had found beneath the cottonwood. What she needed was someone who understood how those pieces could matter legally. That person was Lucas Mendoza, a water rights attorney who had grown up around ranch families and knew that in the West, old water records could carry more weight than new construction plans. Claire could not afford his normal retainer, but after reviewing Megan Cross's maps and photographs of the gallery, Lucas agreed to help under a deferred payment arrangement. He and Megan began searching courthouse records under every family name connected to the valley, not just Whitmore. Days passed with little to show for it. Then Megan found a misfiled agreement from the early 20th century involving 3 homesteading families: the Whitmores, the Caldwells, and the Mercers. Their ancestors had pooled labor and money to build, maintain, and share the hillside spring system long before modern irrigation reached Willow Bend. That discovery transformed the gallery from a family curiosity into evidence of an organized agricultural water network. But Lucas focused on something even more important. The old channel had never become completely dry. The trickle Noah discovered meant water had continued moving through the gallery even after formal maintenance stopped. That mattered because the central question was no longer whether the system had been forgotten. It was whether the historic water interest had truly been abandoned. If water had continued flowing, even quietly, the answer might be no. For the first time, Claire had something stronger than suspicion. She had a chain connecting the old families, the spring, the land, and continuous use. Then Lucas found the document that changed the entire fight. Buried inside Holbrook Development's purchase records for the Ridge property was a clause referring to unresolved legacy agricultural water interests. Claire read the words twice. Holbrook's company had not necessarily known every detail of the spring gallery, but someone on their side had known enough to recognize the risk before construction began. Suddenly, Grant Holbrook's behavior made sense. A confirmed historic water corridor could force Canyon Crest Estates to redesign drainage, relocate planned home sites, preserve additional setbacks, and surrender acreage that had been counted as profitable development land. The spring was not threatening his company because it was mysterious. It was threatening his numbers. Holbrook did not need to be a cartoon villain to want the problem gone. He only needed a project whose profits depended on the old water system staying forgotten. And now, because a 12-year-old boy had noticed one green patch of grass, that assumption was beginning to collapse. But proving the spring existed was one thing. Bringing it back without destroying it would decide whether everything Claire had fought for actually mattered. After a tense county hearing, she finally received permission to stabilize and investigate the old gallery under strict supervision. Work began the next morning. Near the entrance, a small excavator removed loose soil and exposed the stone structure. But farther inside, there was no room for machinery. From that point on, the restoration looked almost exactly like the kind of work the original ranch families must have done generations earlier. Shovels, buckets, timber braces, pry bars, and careful hand. Earl Benson moved slowly, warning the crew that every stone they removed could change the pressure on the wall above it. They cleared tangled roots, hauled out black silt, and lifted fallen rock one piece at a time. The first day brought nothing, The second brought only a little more seepage. By the fourth, Claire could barely stand to watch. Money was disappearing into labor, permits, equipment, and supplies, while the ranch above them was still short on water. She began wondering if she had mistaken persistence for foolishness. If the spring had once been useful but had finally died sometime before Noah was born. Then Earl called for her. Deep inside the hillside, behind a wall of compacted sediment, he had uncovered a small stone collection chamber. Set into it was a rusted iron control gate, bent but still recognizable. And behind that gate was water, cold, clear, and steady. Not a flood, not a miracle, a living source. Earl and the crew spent hours cleaning the chamber and repairing the gate just enough to move it safely. When they finally opened it, everyone waited. Nothing dramatic happened. A thin ribbon slipped forward, then another. Water crept into the stone channel inch by inch, filling cracks that had been dry for decades. Claire walked beside it as it advanced downhill, afraid to believe what she was seeing. Noah ran ahead toward the cottonwood, back to the exact patch of sedge grass where the story had begun. The soil darkened first. Then a narrow stream appeared between the stones and reached daylight. Claire did not cheer. She grabbed an old 5-gallon ranch bucket and a stopwatch from the truck. Earl smiled because he understood. Emotion could wait. First, they needed to know what the spring could actually produce. Claire timed the flow again and again. It was not enough to irrigate every acre overnight, and it would not erase the losses of the summer. But it was steady. It was measurable. And most importantly, it proved the old system was alive. For the first time since the ditch went dry, Claire was no longer fighting over the memory of water. She was standing beside water that was moving again. For the greatest thing Willow Bend recovered was not the water. It was the knowledge that nearly disappeared with the generation that built it. In the weeks that followed, the county formally recognized the historic agricultural water arrangement, forcing Hallbrook Land and Development to revise its drainage plan and protect the established water corridor running through the hillside. Grant Hallbrook did not go to prison, and Canyon Crest Estates did not collapse. He simply lost the shortcut his project had depended on. Several home sites had to be adjusted, drainage had to be redesigned, and the old ranch water system could no longer be treated as if it did not exist. Claire did not become rich either. She had lost hay, sold cattle earlier than planned, spent thousands on hauling water, and endured months of uncertainty that no court decision could repay. But Willow Bend Ranch was still hers. By early fall, the cattle tanks were stable again. Fresh alfalfa was pushing green through fields that had looked finished only weeks before, and the tanker truck stopped appearing in the yard every few days. The descendants of the Whitmore, Caldwell, and Mercer families agreed to share responsibility for maintaining the spring gallery, creating a schedule much like the one their ancestors had followed generations earlier. Ben began taking Noah along the hillside, teaching him how old ranchers judged moisture by plants, soil temperature, slope, and the behavior of livestock. Earl showed him how to watch sediment, measure flow, and recognized the first signs that a channel was beginning to clog. Noah wrote everything down in the same battered notebook he had carried before any adult believed that patch of green grass mattered. Months later, Claire found him beneath the cottonwood again, kneeling beside the place where his shovel had first struck stone. "What are you doing?" she asked. Noah shrugged without looking up. "Just checking." Claire smiled because she finally understood what had really been passed down. Not simply 240 acres, not a ditch, not even a spring. It was the habit of paying attention. Willow Bend had survived because a 12-year-old boy noticed something everyone else had learned to ignore. Sometimes the land gives its answer quietly, long before anyone realizes a question needs to be asked. If this story reminded you that the smallest detail can change everything, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories. And tell us in the comments, what is one small thing you noticed that everyone else overlooked until it mattered?